A leader is a prototype of the organization. The organization takes their cue from the leaders. And so when you look at the culture around you or you look at your team, instead of asking what's wrong with the team, sometimes it helps to ask, maybe where am I falling short? Or what's the work that I need to do that might be causing this disconnect or misalignment? It always takes two to tango, isn't it?
Welcome to the Excellent International Leadership Podcast. Your host today works with the world's leading experts on international leadership, helping them find purpose and implement their vision. She's a master certified coach and facilitates a mastermind for CEOs of international companies. She's the author of 3 books and works with Nestle, Novartis, and even the United Nations. She's especially good at helping executives fast track to the C-suite. Welcome, Dr. Katrina Burrus.
Most of us want a deep and meaningful conversation. But what are the elements of a deep conversation? Let's ask Tanvi Gautam, who just wrote a book on deep conversations. Welcome to the Excellent International Leadership Podcast. And today we'll have Dr. Tanvi Gautam. So, Tanvi, tell us a little bit about your background before we start, because you do have an unusual cosmopolitan background.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Dr. Katrina, first of all. Really delighted to be here. And yes, I definitely have been a citizen of the world, as I like to call it. My passport is Singaporean. Educationally, I am American. Spiritually, I am Indian. And affinity-wise, I track to Australia. I've lived and worked in all these places. And so I've carried parts of them with me. My work has been in the area of leadership transformation and leading in the age of disruption. And I began my career in the corporate world in a company known as Arthur Andersen, which some of you may have heard of. And then I was also working in Tata Consultancy Services. So that was my corporate career. I then went on to do my PhD, and I thought I was going to be chair professor of this, that, and the other in academia, but life had other plans. I moved, and now I have a blended career. So I work with multinational companies. I do executive coaching, keynote speaking, consulting, and I also teach at Singapore Management University. So I get best of both the worlds.
Wonderful, Tanvi. So Tanvi, tell us a little bit what you mean about leading in the age of disruption. Can you define it, please? And then we'll go from there.
So yes, leading in the age of disruption is something that I have been working on from way before the pandemic. And let's define that term for a second, because a lot of people like to talk about it, but it can mean different things to different people. And I think the most easy way to talk about it is, without overcomplicating it, because it is a complicated topic, is that disruption is an interruption of the known environment. Now, the known environment could be a business model. The known environment could be the resources you had access to. The known environment could be the tools, technology, regulations, you name it. Now, this is not an ordinary interruption. This interruption is where you find yourself in a place where your past experiences, your resources, your tools no longer are adequate to deal with what is in front of you. So you find yourself in a gap.
So tell us a little bit about examples of the type of clients that come with you with that particular issue.
Right. So disruption, whereas you might think that, okay, disruption is only, because I think particularly because of the pandemic, we tend to think of it as something really wrong and bad and global, but disruption can happen even at a personal level. So for example, when I moved from the US to Singapore, I got completely disrupted. I had no networks. I didn't know anybody in Singapore. I knew the prime minister, but he didn't know me. So that wasn't of much help. I was looking to reinvent my career, etc. So that was a personal disruption. right? And then industries get disrupted. So the very common examples we hear about, how the rideshare industry got disrupted, how the streaming industry came about by disrupting traditional models of entertainment. So those are industry level disruptions. And then there are global disruptions, the way the pandemic happened. So when the clients come to me, it could be because maybe they are in a new role that they find themselves out of their depth. It could be that they are in the same role, but they find their team has expanded, their mandate has expanded. And again, their experiences and tools no longer are adequate to deal with this situation. Or it could be CEOs or HR heads who come to me and say, we've adopted a new business model, but our way of thinking, our way of doing things is still old school, or it's still aligning to the more traditional way of doing work. And so what do we do now? So that question, what do I do now? Or what do we do now? Is kind of the doorway to come and start working with me. And I think the other thing that is common to all my clients that come to work with me is they're not just looking for left brain analytical tools for solving their problems, but they're also looking for heart-based tools which engage the human spirit and the human emotion as we undergo transformation. So I think that would be the kind of clients I end up working with.
So the hard, usually I would say the soft issues are the emotional aspect, the personal, the interpersonal. You're calling that the hard.
The heart issues, as in
Heart. Sorry. Okay, the heart issues.
which, by
Yes,
the way, you're not wrong. I do think that interpersonal issues are the harder issues. I think we do a big service by calling them soft skills. They are the hard skills for sure, like you said. And I actually like to refer to them as prime skills, because in the absence of these prime skills, it doesn't matter what other investments you're making and organization design changes you're making, because ultimately the implementation is through human beings. And if
right.
human beings don't know how to navigate that transformation at a human level, which is, by the way, been a missing conversation in this field for a very long time, then a lot of the momentum is undone. Progress is slower. And that's when you can get with statistics like 70% of all change management efforts fail. And it's not that change management has failed, it's that you have failed change management. There's a big difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, okay, so you've given us a lot of reasons why leaders come to you. Now, what are the difference in types of issues between before the pandemic and after the pandemic? Are there the same issues but a different perspective, or the environment in which they work is totally different?
I think it's a little bit of both, but there has been a shift. One of the big things that is coming up is self-leadership, which is how do we learn to lead ourselves before we lead others? And I think this was important pre-pandemic, but it's even more important now, because when things are in a state of fluidity, the way they are right now, each person has to lead exactly where they are with what they have and make the most of it. And that requires a lot of self-leadership. That work has become much more important, that act of reflection, of thinking about how am I going to lead myself so that I can lead my people. So that's one of the things. The second skill
Is it
set.
more awareness then that the self-leadership impacts the people? Is it more awareness because, or is there a shift in mindset that before people accepted a top-down perspective and now they're expecting a more collaborative type of leadership?
So collaborative leadership is definitely another skill. I think self-leadership and self-awareness feeds into collaboration, but it is something that we do treat on its own as well. And I think you're right. The awareness is up, the mindset shift is coming. But I think prior to the pandemic, it wasn't so much of a conversation, right? We always were looking at how do we manage the team? How do you manage the organization? Now I'm like, wait a second. If I'm having a problem with all 5 people on my team, maybe I am the problem. Maybe I need to do some self-reflection, right? And at the end of the day, I always tell people that a leader is a prototype of the organization. The organization takes their cue from the leaders. When you look at the culture around you or you look at your team, instead of asking what's wrong with the team, sometimes it helps to ask, maybe where am I falling short? Or what's the work that I need to do that might be causing this disconnect or misalignment? But it always takes 2 to tango, isn't it?
Right. So they're more self-aware, basically.
Yes, much more self-aware on how they may be contributing to what they are seeing around themselves.
So that's one of the big difference pre and post. Okay. Is there any other before I ask you another question?
I would say there are 2 more. So the first, like I said, is self-leadership. The second is around the ability to what I call as more staying power, which has to do with working in a sustainable manner. You know, the leaders themselves still are pretty exhausted. I don't think that the environment around is helping. Companies are still recovering from the impact of the pandemic, and we haven't emerged on the other side fully. And you already are seeing the war in different parts of the world, whether it's in Ukraine or things that are going on in Israel. There is a level of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion in the workplace. And then there has been this series of layoffs across the globe, which are not contributing to the sense of cohesion and let's build this thing together. In fact, I was keynoting the Mercer conference last month. And one of the key things that's emerging is that we're not being able to sustain the momentum that we saw during the pandemic, right? Where we were like, okay, decentralized decision-making, let's focus on wellness, you know, all these new things that we started doing in the workplace, which were long overdue. Some of it is rolling back. And I'm seeing executives saying no to roles that are no longer, you know, feeding their soul. They're asking, you know, why am I doing what I'm doing? And so it's no longer as simple as, oh, I have this great role and it's fantastic and let me just take it. No. And I think that's possibly linked to what I was saying earlier, the self-leadership and that self-reflection of what do I want in my relationship with work, right? And so leading in that environment, again, requires a different set of skills.
So what are those different set of skills, sir?
I think the first is acknowledgement of the human element. You know, people say, we talk about human resources, and I always tell people, humans are not the resource, their humanity is, their creativity is, their ability to come together in service of a larger goal is. Starting from that point, which is a little bit foreign, because I always tell people, if you imagine, right, Katrina, if the history of the corporate world as we know it, where the corporate is a separate entity, legal entity from, you know, individuals, let's assume it's existed for 150 years, right? We spent 148 years, it's an imaginary timeline. We spent 148 years beating humanity out of the workplace. Keep your emotions out of the workplace. I don't want to hear about your family. I don't want to know what's going on in your personal life. Work is work. Home is home. Don't tell me about it. Come in, head down. You're a pair of hands. You're a head. That's it. 148 years, we've beaten humanity out of the workplace. Now, you might ask what happened in 48 to 50? Pandemic happened. Otherwise, we would have continued doing that. And so we are standing at the 151st year, imaginary timeline. And we've realized that in the age of artificial intelligence, humans have to be more humans. We have to attend to our burnout. We have to attend to, emotions. We have to have difficult conversations about what's happening in the world around us, but we don't have the skills. And so the one first skill is to start acknowledging the human element at work and saying, how do I support the humanity of the people so that they feel like they are a part of a unit that actually cares about them as a person, which then allows them to bring their whole self, allows them to have greater commitment to what they do. We were talking about this for sure in terms of things like, say, employee engagement, but that was still very, very superficial. That was very, very superficial. Now we have to deep dive. Now we have to learn to connect with each other with a sense of vulnerability. We need to help people understand how they can design their work so that it's linked more to their purpose. We have to understand that when we talk about the life cycle, the employee life cycle, it's not just about hiring to retiring. If you talk to any HR professional, they say the employee life cycle, hiring to retiring. It's not. That's the employee cycle. The employee life cycle is I became a new mother. The employee life cycle is I have aging parents I have to care for. The employee life cycle is somebody close to me just lost their job. That support system has been missing. How to have that conversation has been missing.
So the first step is self-leadership, which you explain, then sustainability, and then would you say the third is the humanizing the work?
Rehumanizing. I think the
Re
word,
means it was human before.
yes, I do think work was human before we created the corporate model. I think there are alternate business models to the corporations as we know it, particularly in Asia. There is a lot of companies that started as family-owned businesses, and that sense of close-knitness and people being there for each other and a sense of affinity was definitely higher till we adopted a very capitalist business model, which was like, keep yourself and your life out of the workplace happen. Unfortunately, I think we over index on a particular type of way of doing business, which definitely is more common, but it's not the only way of doing business. That's why I use the word rehumanizing.
Great. That's great. Okay. So, and you mentioned then Singapore and all. Give us a little bit of insight how this has panned out in different places of the world.
Yeah, I think that, so let me give you an analogy. When the pandemic broke out, the companies that were able to cope with it best being in air quotes, right, were companies that had already begun work on digital transformation, were companies that had already begun work on culture transformation, companies where conversations about a human workplace had already started to happen. And they were able to cope with it much better because they had a starting point. So it's the same when you kind of zoom back and look at a global perspective. So how countries like Sweden, for example, dealt with it was very different from the way country like, say, India or Singapore dealt with it. Very different from the way US dealt with it, right? Because their starting off point was different. We were not starting from the same point. And then, of course, the size of the country and, their past experiences with the pandemic kind of played into all of this. So that is to say that think of it as a bell curve, and you can locate countries and companies on that bell curve in terms of how quickly they were able to pivot and make the transformation into the more human-centric workplace. And here's the thing, some of them still haven't done it.
Okay, so give us a specific example. For example, Sweden, the US, and Singapore.
Right. So I think that, Sweden being a European country, the way they experimented with things in the workplace, they have a pretty advanced workplace. I think their work practices and their ability to look at work-life situations has been ahead. I mean, you've been looking at Nordic countries as examples of, balancing or blending and harmonizing work and life for a very long time, way before the pandemic. So for them to put in policies and places that respected the trauma of the pandemic was much easier. When you come to a place like Singapore, which is a very competitive culture, by the way, in Singapore, we really try to punch above our weight. We try to be the best at everything, trying to find, for example, FaceTime culture was very important in Singapore. I had to see you at work to believe that, yes, you were actually working. That, is a very, very important part of the way the work organization happened. So suddenly now for people to start developing trust that, you're in a remote environment and you are still working and you're doing what is necessary, that definitely took some leadership skill in recognizing, yes, work can be done remotely. I find one of the big transitions, and this was in the news actually just yesterday, about how a lot of young people are now taking sabbaticals, which is kind of unheard of prior to the pandemic to create that work-life blend and to create a more human relationship with work. And so Nordic countries, which had a culture of that sort, switched in more easily. Places like Singapore, where this wasn't really a conversation. I mean, we talked about it, but we were not paying that much attention to it. For them, it was a much bigger transformation. And US, where you are, as you know, is a bit of a mixed bag. It kind of depends on the industry you've been. I think tech probably had it easier. Some of the others still took their time. But on the whole, I found that US moved forward far more quickly than some of the other parts of the world. And why did that happen is a whole separate conversation. But to conclude, your prior relationship with some of these conversations determined how you morphed during the pandemic with some of these practices.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift the conversation. Thank you, Tanvi. And we're going to talk about your book. So you have come out with coming out with a book on conversations. So I would like to ask you, what are the 5 conversations? Which one is the hardest to get to?
Right. So the book is called Deep Collaboration. 5 crucial conversations to accelerate team performance across silos. So that's a bit of a mouthful right there. And the book is focused on helping teams to be able to work across silos, which is a very common theme with almost all my clients across the globe, because post-pandemic, we have shifted business models. And in the new lay of the land, we need people to work outside their silos. So whether it is commercial with supply chain, whether it's IT with HR, we have to leave our safe spaces and come out and learn to collaborate with each other, which again is, I think, a shift which has happened more post-pandemic. So the reason I chose to work on conversations is because conversations are a very, very powerful tool. Let me give you an example. So if you got an email is written conversation, right, which said, we need to talk. How does your body chemistry feel even as you read that sentence which says we need to talk? You're already kind of like a knot in the stomach, and what's going on? What do I not know? How quickly can we have this conversation? And what was the last mail I sent? Was it that thing I said that? Your mind is like, body chemistry is shifting, your mind is all tied up. But if you got an email saying, oh, I can't wait to talk to you. And you're like, why? What happened? Like, tell me about it. What's the news? And so simple choice of words has the power to completely shift our body chemistry. And so conversations are the first point of connection that we have. So if you're trying to work across silos, what better place to start than learning to have the key conversations, the crucial conversations that will allow us to collaborate better, right? And so there are 5 conversations. We don't have time to go into all of them. One is around deep inspiration. Do you feel you are part of pursuing something that together is meaningful for you beyond the dollars and cents imperative? There's the deep learning conversation, which is all about learning to understand the dynamics, the metrics, the frameworks that people use on the other side of the boundary. The third one is around deep friction, which is learning to navigate the inevitable breakdowns that happen when you're in a cross-silo situation. The fourth one is around deep strategizing. It's how do you have a conversation about your strategy, which is not superficial, which actually takes into account the interconnectedness of what you're doing. And the final one is called deep daring, which is all about risk-taking and navigating uncertainty. So those are the 5 conversations. Coming to which one is the hardest, I definitely think this is across the board, across industries, across the globe. So far, at least, I have not come across an exception. Every time I run this, poll, whether it's in the classroom at the business school or it's in a conference of 5,000 people, my data so far tells me this is the hardest conversation. Let me see. Can you take a guess? What do you think is the hardest of these?
The friction one.
Exactly. It is the friction one, right? And it's so difficult because oftentimes we don't have the skill set, right? Who's keen on, if I asked anybody, raise your hand, are you keen on having a difficult conversation right now? No, nobody's, interested in having a difficult conversation. But the quality of your conversations around difficult issues is what determines your progress. So sometimes we don't have the skill set. That's one. Second, sometimes we have been brought up in cultures that are conflict averse. We want to maintain harmony. We want to carry people with us. I mean, that's one of the things I've had to adjust to as I transitioned out of US into living and working in Asia was the conflict was never overt and in your face. It was there, but you had to recognize it.
So give us a
And
specific example of your experience.
so I'm trying to think what might be a good personal example. It's so I I was talking to a client about something, and it's been a client of mine for a few years, and we were talking about a new project that we were launching, and suddenly the person who I was talking said something like, "Yes," and then there was also our experience of the previous project, and I thought to myself, how is the previous project even relevant here? I mean, we are talking about the current project. That project is done and over with. And if I went with my superficial thinking, I would have just looked at it as this is a new project that was done and over with. Why are we even talking about that? But when I was thinking about it later, I realized that there had been a huge breakdown that had happened in that team between the two leaders. And they were going to be coming back together in this team as well. And nobody wanted to call out their leaders and say, oh, those two don't get along, those two have interpersonal dynamics, because, that's kind of damaging reputation for those two people. And so it's a very subtle reference which you're supposed to get. So it's very context dependent conversation. So you have to have the grasp of the larger context. Otherwise, what might seem like a very casual, oh, then, there was the experience of the previous project that we learned from, seems like a very innocuous, yes, we learned from it. But what they're trying to do is to try to flag something. So it's a more context dependent, subtle kind of communication, which allows you to, there's this phrase called give face and keep face, which is not damaging the reputation of another person, not making them uncomfortable. It's very important in collectivist and many of the Asian cultures. And so reading between the lines is a very, very key skill, right? So now just imagine most of the teams now are cross-cultural. You could have, a German leader sitting in Australia leading a team of people who are from Vietnam. 3 different cultures, 3 different orientations towards how conflict should be managed. The Germans are upfront and direct. The Vietnamese are very gentle people who will always seek harmony first before they get into a headfront kind of a conversation. Their preference is to sort it in many different ways versus direct conversation. And then there is the Australians whose sense of humor, by the way, even though I lived and worked in Australia, I sometimes don't quite get, right? And so it's all those dynamics. So question number 1, do you have the skill set? Second, do you have the inclination because of your cross-cultural leanings? And the third is the organization culture. How does organization culture respond to conflict? So companies like Amazon don't have an issue, put the fish on the table, let's talk about it. And I know some people who will not thrive in Amazon at all because it's a very, very, say it as it is, solve it right here, talk to me about the issue. There are other cultures where they're not going to do that.
Right.
And
The Swiss and American, because I'm both, the Swiss are conflict avoidant. Americans will say it the way it is. If they're pushed to shove, they will. Right. Yeah.
And so even having a conversation on, here is my filter, here are my filters about conflict. Here is my first report call about conflict. These are conversations we need to have. So it's not that conflict will not happen, which of course it will, especially if you're doing anything important and complex, as a lot of these business transformations are. But have you had a conversation about rupture is inevitable, but repair has to be intentional?
Right. Very well said.
Thank you.
Hmm.
And that intentionality has to be discussed. So something as simple as, hey, Katrina, if you have a problem with me, will you please let me know? Because if you go and talk to my boss about it, it puts me in a very awkward situation. And so happy to have a coffee about it whenever, but do me the favor. Versus if you have a problem about what we are doing, let's set up a meeting and let's make sure the boss is in there so that everybody knows what's going on and we are all on the same page. With all on the same page conversation is a very American, let's get everybody in the room and let's sort it out, right? And so being aware of people's preferences, deciding what will be our conflict culture.
Right, conflict culture, and really express it.
Yeah.
And the differences and the similitude, and what could be offensive in one culture is not in another.
Absolutely. I was just reflecting yesterday on conversations because the book has got questions for each conversation. Here are the questions to get you started. It's a very applied book. I want you to read it and start using it tomorrow morning. It's not one of those huge theory 500-page books. Very, very applied. And so when you finish talking to someone and you say something like, do you have any questions? That's not the most inviting way to get people to share their dissent or push back or come at the question unless people are comfortable with it. A much more productive way of asking exactly the same question is, what questions do you have? Which makes an assumption that you have a question and is not as quick to reply with a yes or no as, do you have any questions? You see the difference between
absolutely. One's open-ended, one's closed-ended.
Yeah, right. Sure. Do you have any questions versus what questions do you have? What questions you have is open and inviting. Again, it goes back to conversational intelligence. I mean, I studied under Judith Glasser, who was the one who originated the whole conversational intelligence paradigm. Literally a few words here and there, the interpersonal dynamics, our nervous systems, our body chemistry, all of this shifts. And that's why the book is called Deep Collaboration, because I'm not interested in that superficial intellectual conversation. I want to bring our heart and our mind and our nervous system and our biochemistry into consideration, because that's the human software.
So tell us, because we're coming to the end of our podcast, tell us, where can we purchase your book?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Of course, it's going to be on Amazon for pre-order, but I would love for people to go to my website, which is leadersupgraded.com, because who doesn't like an upgrade? So leadersupgraded.com/deep DEEP, because that's where we're going to be putting all the book updates, the book bonuses. There will be a link to purchase the book and other fun stuff that we are planning around the book. So that would be a great place to go, or of course, then Amazon.
Thank you so very much, Tanvi. Most interesting. And I encourage the listeners to purchase your book.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I really enjoyed the time to reflect on some of these things with someone like you who has such deep expertise. And I look forward to continuing to learn from you through your podcast.
Well, we all will learn from your podcast. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent International Leadership Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com and select podcasts. Join us each Thursday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your leadership to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burrus's coaching programs and the International Leadership Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.